This sturdy Midwestern city full of pragmatic and forward-looking people is such a fitting place for us to be talking about what the possible pathways might be to a deeply decarbonized electricity system by mid-century. Now, before I say more, though, I want to pause and just express my gratitude and admiration for the members of the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative, and you know who you are. Really an extraordinary group, and many of you have been working together for years now. This is a rare collection of leaders from investor-owned utilities, from electric cooperatives, merchant power companies, environmental groups, states, really an extraordinary group, and have exhibited, I think, perhaps not unique, but this rare willingness to grapple with really complex, sometimes contentious issues with civility and intellectual rigor. So on behalf of my GPI colleagues and indeed the region, I want to thank you for the time and effort you have put in together over the years and on this roadmap in particular, and just to say that it is really a privilege for us at Great Plains Institute to be working with you on this important work. So not to get too philosophical here, but particularly I would say in today's environment where the public discourse on all kinds of issues can often be fractured, where you have different interests often talking past one another and not really taking the time to deeply understand another's point of view or the influences that shape that point of view, it seems all the more important to just note, it's even in the name, that this group is collaborative and so willing to work with one another. And the very existence of the collaborative seems like something that we ought to celebrate. Another distinguishing feature of the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative that I think is worth noting is that it's entirely voluntary. I mean, if you scroll back a decade, the conversation around carbon was really driven by the specter of federal regulation, and that's obviously no longer true today. And while that is still a sort of an eventuality that informs the collaborative's work, its members continue to engage on this issue out of a sense of mutual interest and common good. Importantly, the collaborative also provides this sort of ongoing platform or forum for exploring how this region can seize the opportunity presented by transitioning our electric sector and ultimately our transportation and building sectors as well. And I say opportunity because I feel like we tend to think about carbon as simply a risk to mitigate rather than a chance to lead what is in truth really a global technological revolution and a race in a way to reimagine how humans power our lives. The roadmap that the collaborative is unveiling today underscores that this region's resource base has positioned it as a net exporter of zero carbon electricity and that it has the potential to grow those exports over time. So put differently, I think you can think about this roadmap as leading the way on electric sector decarbonization can be in effect a source of comparative advantage for this region. And looking at this transition as a source of economic opportunity rather than simply as a matter of avoiding risks makes even more sense if one pauses to consider what other large players around the world are doing in this sector. And here I'm thinking in particular about China. Now, as is the case for everything from artificial intelligence and quantum computing to rolling out 5G mobile networks, China is seeking advantage in this zero and low carbon energy technology space in everything, and I think because it believes that these technologies will dominate both this century and beyond, in everything from solar panels and batteries to carbon capture and electric vehicles. And I want to offer you just a couple of data points to underscore that idea. Chinese companies are responsible for producing 60% of the solar panels sold in 2017. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that of the roughly 385,000 electric transit buses that are on the world's roads, 99% of those buses are in China. where they are adding, this blows my mind, they are adding some 9,500 electric buses every 5 weeks. So that's the size of London's transit bus fleet, all electric every 5 weeks in China. Now, I realize electric buses are not a power sector technology per se, but I think these two examples, solar and EV bus dominance taken together, point to the speed and scale of the electric sector transformation that is happening elsewhere. So while the focus of this roadmap and our discussion today is appropriately on the mid-continent region, we should be thinking about this transition against the backdrop of this global transition that's taking place and this competition that is underway to lead the technological revolution that will make a very low-carbon energy system possible. In other words, the roadmap we're discussing today presents a chance for this region to skate where the puck is going to be, to use a tired sports metaphor, and I don't even play hockey. But I think it's apt. So it's time to lace up those skates for us here in the region. Before I wrap up, I just want to say a couple of other things. I want to thank in advance the incredible set of speakers who have made time to be here today and share their expertise and experience. And I also want to offer Sustainable Energy Economics and Evelyn, where are you, Evelyn? For her incredible work. Her firm has done the modeling that undergirds the roadmap that we're releasing today. And I also want to offer my gratitude to my GPI colleagues who have shepherded this important work and who have made today possible. You are incredible. You are the reason I get up in the morning, and I want to thank you for all your hard work. I would say long-term planning and foresight are not always humanity's strong suits. But I would say that the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative and the work that they've done in this roadmap are evidence that it is possible. It is possible for us to look around the corner collectively. And your presence here today suggests that you not only think it's possible, but essential. So I want to thank you all very much for coming, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much for coming. You can clap right there. Yeah. So this is a weird interstitial, but I don't know another time to tell you this. So I'm just going to say the restrooms, should you need them, are straight back and to the right. And the food and drink, these sort of go in tandem, I suppose, but the food and drink is going to stay in that room, which you've hopefully already found, which is out there, out the door and to the left. And for those of you who are online, I realize that that's entirely meaningless, and you should just attend to your own needs, as you should in the room as well. So with that as preamble, I didn't want to take too long, but I did want to take just a minute to set the stage. With that as preamble, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce a longtime GPI friend and colleague, Judi Greenwald, who's going to be our keynote speaker today. Judi has a distinguished background. You can find her bio in your program, but allow me to share just a few highlights so that you know who's going to be standing in front of you in a minute here. Until 2017, Judi was the Deputy Director for Climate, Environment, and Energy Efficiency at the U.S. Department of Energy and served as Senior Climate Advisor to the Secretary of Energy during that stint. She has 35 years of experience working on energy and environmental policy, including 14 years at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which was formerly the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. She has served as the Senior Advisor on the White House Climate Change Task Force and as a member of the professional staff of the U.S. Congress Energy and Commerce Committee. She has served in a number of advisory roles, including for EPRI, on several National Academy of Sciences panels studying vehicles and fuels, and for pretty near every state and regional climate initiative that I can think of in the Northeast, Midwest, West, and of course California, which we all know is its own region unto itself. Judi received her BS in engineering cum laude from Princeton University, perhaps you've heard of it, and an MA in science, technology, and public policy from George Washington University. We at GPI are so grateful and honored to call Judi a friend and colleague. Won't you please welcome Judi Greenwald.
Thanks so much, Rolf. It's really a pleasure to be here. And he even lowered the microphone for me. Usually I have to do that myself. In fact, I don't think I've ever raised a microphone in my life. So that's right. So thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I'm going to get right into it. I'm here to provide at least one national perspective on this really important work that you're doing here at the regional level, here in the Midwest, and hopefully it will reform this very important work that you're doing. So I'll start with some broad framing, which are that greenhouse gas emissions are the interplay of technology, innovation, market forces, human behavior, and public policy. And public policy happens, as most of you know, at many levels: international, federal, state, and local. And I think too often we get into debates about which is more important. Is it innovation, or is it public policy, or is it markets, or is it behavior? And it's really all of them, and they all interact in real time and over time. And I put a little gray highlight on federal just to point out that even though a lot of we're having a fairly intense debate about what the feds should or shouldn't be doing or are or aren't doing, but that the federal policy is really important, but it's just one of many important things that drive our emissions. So we have to both be concerned about it, but also put it in perspective. So to illustrate a little bit about this interplay of technology, innovation, public policy, and market forces, I want to look a little bit at the power sector and what's happened over the past several decades. And this is US electricity generation by major energy sources from 1950 to 2017. The black is coal, the blue is natural gas, red is nuclear, green is renewables, and orange is oil. And as most of you know, over the past decade, we've seen natural gas, cheap natural gas, outcompeting coal in the market. And that's been pretty much a market phenomenon. And that's actually been one of the major causes of our greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector declining over the past decade. But how did we get to the point where we have cheap natural gas? Well, there was the shale gas revolution. How do we get the shale gas revolution? Well, some of the seeds of that revolution were planted back in the late 1970s when we had a tax credit, very generous tax credit, that was put in place for what was then called unconventional natural gas exploration. And over the ensuing decades, there was this tax credit, there was a lot of federal and private sector R&D, and we got better and better at hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, and horizontal drilling, so that we got to the point where we got cheaper and cheaper natural gas and abundant natural gas that can now outcompete coal in the market. So it might look like a market-driven phenomenon completely now, but it has its roots in this interplay of technology, innovation, and public policy over many decades. And you see sort of a similar thing, and we're a little bit later in time in this process that's happening with renewables. We've had many decades, or a couple of decades, of federal and state policy, federal production tax credit and investment tax credit, as well as state renewable portfolio standards, as well as a lot of technology innovation by the public and private sector that's getting us cheaper and cheaper renewables over time. And the expectation is that they will soon, if not already in some places, be able to outcompete other technologies in the market. So these things interact over time, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we explore these sectors. So I'm gonna, with that framing, I'm gonna dig deep into something called the US MidCentury Strategy for deep decarbonization. How many people know about this thing? This is a sophisticated audience. Okay, so for those of you who don't, it was released in November 2016. There was a lot else going on that month, so perhaps you missed it. And as you may be able to see, there's a little White House logo on top, but you can no longer find it on the White House website, but you can find it on the UN website. And that's the link. And I'm told you either will get these slides or you can get that link later if what I tell you about this study interests you and you want to explore it further. So why do we have this study? You know, why did we do this? And it's actually a third piece of the Paris Agreement that most people don't know about. The first two pieces of the Paris Agreement are a 2-degree target. We're trying to keep warming to below 2 degrees. And the second piece is that every country has to produce a nationally determined contribution, or NDC target, that they self-decide. They decide them, each country decides for itself what its target's going to be, what it can accomplish. And they're usually, the targets are about 10 or 15 years out. And the idea of the Paris Agreement is that we're going to keep putting forth these targets, we're going to iterate over time, and we're going to increase ambition over time to get to the 2-degree target. And that's kind of the bottom-up, top-down pieces of the Paris Agreement that most people know about. But there's this third piece, which is that parties, the countries that are party to the agreement, are invited to produce mid-century strategies by 2020. So these aren't due yet, but a few countries, including Canada, the United States, and Mexico, decided to go early, actually 4 years early, on these strategies. And these particular 3 countries, other countries have also gone early, a few, and they decided this as part of another effort, which is the North American Clean Energy Initiative. And they decided, we're going to go early, we're going to be role models, we're going to show that this can be done, and we're going to also show that it can be done in 3 different ways, because every country should and can do it its own way. So the idea was to basically provide a starting point for people who are trying to think about how to do this. So I offer you this not because this particular strategy has official status, so its status is somewhat indeterminate, but to offer that we learn some things, we learn some lessons, and hopefully that those lessons could be useful to you in your regional work. So this is the US Mid-Century Strategy in a nutshell. This slide violates all the rules of slides. Some of you who are familiar with when I run conferences are probably cracking up, because I would never let you use a slide like this. So, so what I did was Xerox produced these handouts so that you could follow along on the handout and not get eye strain trying to look at this slide. So this is the US Mid-Century Strategy in a nutshell. So the y-axis is net greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide, in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And by net emissions, I mean our gross emissions, which we put up into the atmosphere through our various activities, minus the emissions that we sequester, that we capture from out of the atmosphere. We actually, on net, absorb or suck carbon out of the atmosphere from soils and plants and trees. So our net emissions are our gross emissions minus what we sequester. So in 2005, that's the left-hand column, we actually was something about 6.5 gigatons on our net emissions. And then if you look at the very, very right-hand column, out in 2050, we have to get 80% below that. So that's something a little bit under 2 gigatons. In order to do, so we have to get from the very left column to the very right column. In order to do the analysis, we set up a reference case where we assume there wouldn't be any policy. And in that reference case, it's the second column on the left, you'll see that we're expecting, in the absence of policy, a lot of growth in CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and the F gases, which are these gases with long names that have important functions that are substitutes for ozone-depleting gases, which we can get into in the Q&A if you like. And then we also have to add in, we are expecting our sink to weaken over the next few decades. As many of you know, in the colonial era, the United States actually deforested quite a bit, and since then we've been afforesting at a fairly significant clip, and that process is expected to slow down. We're expected to afforest less going forward, so the sink is expected to weaken. So we have to account for that. So in our reference case, we're actually at about 10 gigatons. So getting from 10 down to below 2, it's actually bigger than an 80% reduction that's needed at the national level. So that's the challenge, and we put together 3 sets of solutions to how we could get from the left to the right. And we have to transform the energy system, we have to sequester carbon, and we have to reduce non-CO2 emissions. Transforming the energy system involves energy efficiency, decarbonizing electricity, and fuel switching. And you'll see there are a lot of people who are, or some people, a lot of people, a few of us who work on this stuff, yourselves included in this room. And there's a literature on decarbonizing, what does that look like? And you will often see this basic strategy that you decarbonize the power sector because that's where we have more options, and then you electrify other end uses so that those end uses now switch over to decarbonized electricity. So that combination strategy is fairly common in the literature. And as you'll see under the energy efficiency column, there's transportation, buildings, and industry efficiency. Under decarbonizing electricity, it's a mix of strategies. It's renewables, fossil fuels with carbon capture. Carbon capture is when you catch the emissions as they're coming out of the smokestack, and you capture the CO2 and you bury it deep underground in geological formations so that you get very low emissions on net, and also some nuclear power. And then under fuel switching, we're switching over to biofuels, some hydrogen, and we're doing this electrification that I mentioned, changing some of those fuel uses, direct fuel uses, into electricity. Under sequestering carbon, the idea is through land management and soil management and better forest management and farm management that we would do better, and we'd sort of get back to the sequestration levels that we had in the past so that we could, through smart management, we'd strengthen the land sink again. And then there's CO2 removal technology, which also is something you'll see in a lot of these decarbonization scenarios where you actually need carbon removal because you can't decarbonize fast enough without it. And that's basically carbon capture combined with biomass combustion. As many of you know, when you combust biomass on a life cycle, on a sustainable basis, on a life cycle basis, you're actually net zero emitting because you're absorbing as much CO2 from the atmosphere as you're growing the biomass as you emit once you combust it. So if you take those CO2 emissions that are coming off of biomass combustion and you bury those deep underground, you're actually getting net negative emissions. And we find in these scenarios that you actually need a negative emissions technology in order to get to the target. And then finally, we reduce the non-CO2 emissions through, for example, controlling leaks from natural gas systems that reduces methane. For example, we better nitrogen fertilizer management to reduce nitrous oxide emissions and finding substitutes for these F-gases. So that's how we get to the target. I want to emphasize a few things that are especially significant. One is that the land sink and CO2 removal technology is really important, or are really important. On that left part of the picture, you can see this is 1990 to 2014, sort of historically what was happening with net emissions. The blue is our CO2, the pink is our non-CO2, and the green is the land sink. And as you can see, the land sink really helps us because it takes us from the top of the blue to that yellow to that white dashed line. So it's helpful. But in the out years, when we're trying to get to these very, very low levels of net emissions, you'll see that the land sink and the CO2 removal technologies are actually offsetting half of our gross emissions. So it really becomes very, very important as you get to these low level of emissions, what happens with the land sink and what happens with a CO2 removal technology. And so we did a couple of sensitivities on that to look at that and found, you know, what happens if you don't have either of those things or if you don't have as much of that, and you basically have to reduce your gross emissions much more. So this becomes very, very important in these very deep decarbonization scenarios. This is what our energy system looks like under the MidCentury Strategy. So 2005 is that left-hand pie chart. It's much bigger than the one on the right, which is 2050. So we get very significant reductions in our energy system emissions. The light gray is electricity. The yellow is transportation. Red is industry. Dark gray is residential buildings, and blue is commercial buildings. And as you can see, most of what's left in the much smaller pie on the right-hand side in 2050, most of what's left is transportation. So we found transportation to be the most challenging sector to decarbonize. So we got deep reductions everywhere, but transportation was a bit harder. This is electricity. As I mentioned, it's from a mix of strategies. The left-hand side is 2005, our generation mix, which was a lot of coal. Some natural gas. Coal is black. Natural gas is brown. I think there's a little bit of pink in there, which is oil. And green is biomass. Blue is hydropower. And orange is nuclear power. So that was back in 2005. And then these right-hand set of columns, the first one is the MCS benchmark, or mid-century benchmark strategy. And as you can see, it's also it's a mix of power sources, but they're all very low carbon, or almost all very low carbon. And there's a lot more electricity, both because we're expecting electricity to grow, we're going to need more electricity, but also because of this intentional electrification, taking other types of fuel uses and making them use electricity instead. And so we get this big mix, and it's a little bit of natural gas, a fair amount of coal with carbon capture, gas with carbon capture, biomass with carbon capture, hydropower, nuclear, and a lot of wind. Wind is the biggest piece of that chart. It's the blue in that left-hand column, and also a fair amount of solar and a little bit of geothermal. We also did some other scenarios. For example, the next column is a smart growth scenario where we use less electricity, so we depend much more on building efficiency, so you don't need as much low-carbon capacity. We also played around with what happens if you take things off the table, if you take one of your options, if you don't allow or have carbon capture, or you don't have biomass. And you find that all of the other technologies have to do more work. So having this portfolio really helps you because you don't know what's going to work in the long run, and then also each piece of the column doesn't have to do as much work if you have a mix of options. The pace of the needed change is actually rapid by historical standard. This shows electricity capacity additions. The left-hand part is 2000 to 2016, and that shows how much capacity we're adding each year. Brown is natural gas. So earlier this century, we were adding quite a bit of natural gas per year, and then we started to add more and more wind. That's the blue. And then we started to add quite a bit of solar. That's the light yellow. And so that's what we were doing the past couple of decades. Going forward in the mid-century strategy, you can see we're adding different types of things, a lot more solar and wind and other low-carbon technologies, but we're adding them at a similar pace to kind of the high end of what we were doing in the past couple of decades. So the pace is kind of similar, at least to the high end for the first part, for 2016 to 2035. But then starting in 2035 to 2050, we actually have to go much faster. We have to accelerate the change out of the high-carbon electricity capacity for the low-carbon electricity capacity. And that's much faster than we've had to do historically. So this is a challenge, and it has to go much faster in order to get to the targets. I'm going to say a little bit about transportation. This is just what's happening with light-duty vehicles. That pink column on the left is 2005 vehicle miles traveled. Pink means diesel or gasoline. So it's pretty much all gasoline and diesel in the sector in 2005. And then the right-hand columns are in 2050 what it looks like. And basically, under our benchmark scenario, we've got more than half of our vehicle miles traveled being driven on hydrogen or electric vehicles. A little bit on biofuels, that's the yellow, a little bit on natural gas, that's the brown, and there's still some pink diesel and gasoline. We also did a smart growth scenario, where we relied much less on electric and hydrogen vehicles and more on smart growth strategies, which would reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. And in that scenario, we have less overall VMT, and there's still a bit more of the gasoline and diesel left in the sector. This is a little bit about both the challenges and the potential for reducing emissions from the transportation sector. This is a four-legged stool of transportation fuel use and emissions. People may have seen this. The left leg is vehicles, then fuels is brown, then the vehicle miles traveled is that green leg, and then there's system operations. Historically, we've had the most success on vehicle efficiency. We've really done dramatic things on the vehicle efficiency side. Our fuel economy standards and more recently our greenhouse gas standards have given us much lower emissions and fuel use than we would have in the absence of those standards. That's been a huge success story. We've had more trouble on the fuels because oil's cheap and it's a great competitor. It's a great fuel and it's hard to compete against. And also we've been less willing than some other countries to tax oil highly enough that it would make it easier to compete with by the other alternative fuels. So that's been our challenge. And of course, vehicle miles traveled is challenging because it's hard to get people to not drive. And so those are the challenges that we've faced historically. We are on the cusp, or some people think we're actually already in the middle of three revolutions that could be game changers. And that's electrification, mobility as a service, meaning sort of what Lyft and Uber do, and automation. And these could potentially dramatically reduce our emissions from the transportation system, but they also could actually dramatically increase them. So the way this goes really depends on that interplay of what I was talking about earlier, of technology, policy, markets, and behavior. Depending on the choices we make, things could really go either way. And I can talk about this a little bit more in Q&A if you like, but just sort of the hint is that automation could actually induce a lot more demand because there are a lot of people who can't drive but could be driven. And there are a lot of people who drive but would actually be driven more than they drive. So you have to figure out how that compares to getting the vehicles to be cleaner to offset that and whether you can have ride sharing. So it's a complicated interaction of what might happen in the future. So it's uncertain, but there's potentially tremendous opportunity to get very deep reductions in a way that we weren't able to do historically. So 2050 is 32 years away. Some people think that's a long time. Some people think it's a short time. It depends on what you're comparing it to. And I just would note that how 32 years compares to the lifetimes of various capital investments. So building appliances last 10 to 20 years, cars 15 to 20 years, industrial equipment 10 to 30 or more years, power plants 40 to 60 or more years, buildings 50 to hundreds of years, and urban form hundreds of years. So if you're thinking that you want to be in a certain place by 2050, you have to start thinking now because you want to affect these investments that are being made now that are going to last a long time. So you want to get going as soon as possible. So the key takeaways, from me at least, are, and this is from the mid-century strategy work that we did, is that deep decarbonization of the US economy is a challenge, but it's doable. That's what we learned. We did it in multiple different ways. We had our core scenario, but there's many pathways to get there. And that time is of the essence. I think that's really the two important things we learned and in general. I also wanted to say, and this isn't really a lesson from the MCS in particular, but I think from any exercise where you're trying to play around with what might happen in the future, that there are no facts about the future. It's basically up to us. The emissions that we will have in the next several decades are up to us in making the decisions that we make in those various pieces that I talked about, the markets, the innovation, the consumer behavior, all of our behavior, and public policy. So it's up to us what happens. So I wanted to leave you with, a lot of people ask me whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about whether we can deeply decarbonize. And so whenever you're asked like a really hard question, you try to find somebody else who's answered it well and then quote them. So Amory Lovins, who many of you know, was a pioneer in clean energy and energy and efficiency. He was asked whether he's an optimist or a pessimist. So he said, I am neither, because they're just two different forms of fatalism. The optimist says that things have to get better, and the pessimist says that things have to get worse. I believe in applied hope. Things can get better, but you have to make them so. So I wish you all to approach your task with hope, with applied hope, and I'm happy to answer questions and be a resource for you, and I'm really impressed with the work that you've done, and I'm very optimistic to the extent that I'm looking with applied hope at the work that you're about to do. So, and I'm happy to take questions, and that's all I've got.
Okay. And I have a mic here for anybody who has questions. And if folks could introduce themselves, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Melissa Hulting from US EPA Region 5 in Chicago. I was wondering about the electrification part of the fuel switching slice and kind of what are the subcomponents of that via transportation, industrial, commercial, residential, that sort of breakdown.
So it's some of each. There's a lot of it is vehicle electrification, which I think I showed. We are, in our core scenario, as you saw we played around. In our core scenario, we've got half of new light-duty vehicle sales in 2035 are hydrogen or electric, and then that translates into about 60% of the vehicle miles traveled being electrified by 2050, because there's this lag where you have to buy the vehicles and then you have to get them into the market. And then we had a fair amount of electrification of heat, which I don't remember offhand, but I can send you, and then some industrial processes were electrified as well.
Was it swamp? Was it mostly transportation, or?
It's most of the electrification. No,
I
there was
can
actually
look it up,
yeah,
too.
there was quite a bit on the heat side as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. In fact, I might have, let me see if I have a slide on that. I might have. So this is buildings, and we had, on the left-hand side is our course is the 2005, and then there's the MCS benchmark, where we had increasing electrification of end use, and we've got electricity low carbon, electricity high carbon, some bioenergy, some gas, some oil, some coal. So you can sort of see that we're using a fair amount less gas directly. So that's a fair amount of heat electrification. Does that help you? Yeah. So it wasn't just transportation.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yes. And the gentleman just reminded me the mic is actually for folks who are coming in online, so please keep it.
Hi, Ben Gerber with the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System. What do you think are the one or two big technological breakthroughs that will help us? And do you have any examples?
So there are a lot. I think for the electric power sector, the way I think about it is there's this mix that we want some fraction of them to work. So I think advanced nuclear, I think carbon capture with storage, I think wind, solar. We want to pursue all of those, and then some fraction of that or some combination of them will work. So I think it's important to pursue the whole portfolio. I think everyone knows about the wind and solar dynamic and how costs are coming down rapidly and you want to do more and more. But I also think these other options also have enormous potential. They've probably been receiving less attention, so I think it's important that we pay attention to them as well. On the vehicle side, technologically, we have electrification, which is potentially hugely important, particularly if we decarbonize the power sector. We also still thought hydrogen might be in the mix, and we kind of did a cheat on the modeling where we basically said the vehicle would either be hydrogen or electric, so we could it could work either way because it would be zero carbon hydrogen or zero carbon electricity. So I still think that hydrogen has a potential for, particularly for the bigger vehicles. So I think it might necessarily be all electric, but certainly progress on that and on batteries really makes a difference. Storage broadly makes a big difference because it will help with basically helping with firming renewables and also making the whole system work better. So I guess I don't think it's any one thing. I think that there's an expression, it's no silver bullet, just a lot of buckshot, and that's how I think about that. We need to pursue all of these different options, some fraction of which will work.
Franz, and we have time for one more question if there's another question. Okay, Nick?
Nick Martin, oh, sorry.
Hi.
Nick Martin with Xcel Energy. So one of the things interesting to me in this and in other analyses, the importance of having some carbon negative electricity technology, and biomass is really the one most often mentioned. But biomass is a small and declining share of our portfolio, and I think generally of the electric sector. And I think that's more than anything because among the slate of eligible renewable technologies for RPSs, it's just it hasn't become more expensive, but the other options have become cheaper and cheaper. So I think that, some people talk about how we're not valuing all the benefits of biomass today, and we're certainly not valuing this carbon negative capabilities. Right. But we're not headed in the direction of having that in the mix, and I'm just curious if you have thoughts about how we would do that or whether we should be.
Yeah, so we definitely, or nothing is definite, we think we're going to need some type of carbon negative technology, and the one that is most feasible based on what we know is this BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. In a world in which you have incentives or policies of some type to actually deeply decarbonize, the pressure would build for technologies like that. There would be incentives. If you're looking for ways to capture CO2 and get it out of the atmosphere, those technologies will become more valuable. So you need some kind of policy push to really push that forward. I do think that in a world without that kind of incentive, it's harder to make the case for biomass. But we do have a fair amount of biomass. Biomass is controversial in many ways. You have to be careful how you grow it and what you do with the land, and it has a lot of impacts. But there are lots of ways that we could incentivize biomass going forward, and this technology in particular. There's actually a carbon capture tax credit that recently went into effect, and that could apply to my biomass, and that could really get some projects going. We'd get some experience and bring the cost down. There's also some potential, for example, this may be dreaming, but maybe we could reform the renewable fuel standard and take it into a low carbon fuel standard, and that might encourage better use of biomass. So I do think there are different strategies, particularly that you here in the Midwest could potentially start to implement, because you do have such a rich biomass resource that could move us down the learning curve and bring down the cost of that so that it could compete with these other technologies with which it's mostly not competitive now. Does that help? Yeah.
Great. Judi, thank you very much.
Thank you.